Dr. Aaron Adair, thank you for meeting me in person here in Boston.
Hey, glad we could make this work out. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you, thank you. I'd like to know a little bit about you. Were you a Christian or were you raised religious in any way?
Yeah, so my family was, primarily Roman Catholic. It was probably practiced more enthusiastically on my mother's side, but for the most part, I don't remember it being that big domineering part of my childhood or my existence. What I remember is Sundays, going to churches, Sunday school for several years, though I honestly remember not being a very good Sunday school student. I was not the most attentive for that because it wasn't, math enough or science enough for me. It wasn't connecting with me all that well. When I'm with my grandparents or other big family events, saying grace for things like that. But for the most part, that was the background noise to my life that we're supposed to be Catholic. Occasionally, maybe hearing about some stories from that thing called the Bible. You might have heard of it before. But really, I only started really properly exploring the religion after I left it. I would say, for the most part, Catholicism would judge or would dictate the wrapping paper for the Christmas presents. That's the sort of coloring I would give. But my own sense of what God and religion are supposed to be was probably much more deistic. I would call myself a Catholic deist for the longest time.
And so what years did you start getting into the science and becoming what you are now?
I knew that I was interested in science from a pretty young age. I remember in particular, with the sorts of movies and TV series at that time, that the characters I would connect with were much more the scientist or engineer. To geek out on stuff from the 80s. If it was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it was much more with Donatello because he does machines. If it was with Ghostbusters, more with Egon because he seemed to do the science stuff. And with movies like Back to the Future, Doc Brown was, that sort of character I felt like I was connecting with the most. By the time I'm in middle school, is probably when I realized what I was the most interested in, what drew me in the most was astronomy and the physics of the universe. By the time I was in high school, I was telling people that I wanted to go to college and study astrophysics. So science very early on, and then getting a little bit narrower to the focus of the science that I wanted to devote my life to.
So I know there's some scientists out there that will believe in God or have a deistic version of God. For you particularly, though, you went down the path of science, and you knew with the wallpaper of Christianity with your upbringing, but you didn't really take it too seriously. When did the turning point happen where you started saying, actually, I'm not sure there even is a God? When did you consciously come up with this, I don't think that there is a God at all?
So I remember towards the end of high school that I was starting to find philosophy books in the library and started reading those. And one of the observations I remember at that time, it was a book that was describing 4 different philosophers from the past, and talking about their ways of going about doing philosophy and the ideas they came up with. And the 4 main philosophers it was focused on were Socrates, Plato, Jesus, and Confucius. And having Confucius with Lao Tzu and that Chinese tradition, of course, to give some level of diversity to it. And I remember just absolutely falling in love with the character of Socrates and the way that he was going about and trying to get to the reality of things, the way that he was going around and questioning people, maybe getting them angry, but pushing them to think in these sorts of interesting ways. And I remember reading that and saying, this is what philosophy is, this is what makes philosophy amazing. And then when it got to the chapter on Jesus, and I really didn't know the gospel story that well, and it tells Jesus is a philosopher because he tells people that they better watch out for the Armageddon. And to me, it just was this doesn't belong in the same category with Socrates. This seems so different. This is not, let's think together. This is somebody coming in and dogmatically, raving about things. It just felt off at that point. But I never, even at that point, thought there's something wrong with religion or theism generally, just that this was not the way to get at how things were going. Later, when I'm in college and I'm, having, my long walks on campus to think about things, I'm, exploring, ideas and thinking what is the expectation for God? What would the perfect designer of the universe actually do? And I feel more and more entrenched in my ideas of deism, that the idea that a God that sets up the universe and doesn't have to tinker is better than a God that does have to come in and tinker. Because you'd think, just like with an engineer, the engineer has to come in and constantly fix things, isn't as good as the engineer who can just have the whole machine run without any extra intervention. If I went and bought a clock and I had to get it repaired every month, that's kind of crummy. If I buy a Rolex and it lasts for 10 years, no problem, that sounds like it's a better engineered product. I apply the same thinking to the Almighty. That's the sort of thing I would expect. And so I'm not like looking for miracles or expecting things like that. But as I ponder things more and discovered things, especially like with atheistic literature, seeing that they were seeing a problem that I was seeing in the world, and that's, the problem of evil. If there is an all good, all perfect, all knowing God who wants the good for all of us, who can intervene and create the best possible world, this doesn't look like what you would expect from that. And I remember, for a long time trying to explore, like, how are the ways to explain that, like the free will defense coming up the most, but thinking, well, that doesn't explain tsunamis and earthquakes. Humans don't cause those. I might get angry and pound the ground, but I'm not causing anything on 7.0 on the Richter scale. And of course, it's so easy to imagine a universe that doesn't require these sorts of things. Or if God has to come in and intervene, and I'm told by religious people that he does occasionally, it's like, well, why not intervene in tsunamis and other terrible things that we have absolutely no control over and can't do anything to prevent? And I just found those answers to be woefully inadequate. And it just seemed like the reason people continue to believe in God after that point of exploring the problem of evil is that they just want God to exist so badly. I didn't feel like I needed to hold on to that. It wasn't that anchor to my life. So when I just said, this doesn't make sense, I was able to let it go. I remember in particular going to a debate, and it was with the atheist lawyer and activist Michael Newdown. He was famous at that time for going to the Supreme Court to try to get like the Pledge of Allegiance not forced in schools because it has the under God phrase in it, things like that. And he was having a debate with another televangelist, Cliff. I can't remember his name so well. Someone told me before, but I have the memory of a goldfish when it comes to names. But I remember going to that debate. I didn't find Newsom's debating skills to be so overwhelming that it convinced me. But I do remember listening to the other person, and I'm just like, these are the arguments they're making. Like when it comes to like, instead of following the science on these sorts of things, where he's like, I says like, well, scientifically proved science. And that's how he's justifying his sort of theism, that science can't know everything. And I'm just like, that's not how any of this works. This is certainly not drawing me in. And during the Q&A, of course, I asked about what was to me the biggest problem, the problem of evil. And again, just saw that the response was free will, free will. And I'm like, I guess there's just really nothing there. So that's, after that day, I felt solidified in saying, yeah, I don't believe, and there's nothing holding me back to going full forward on atheism and naturalism.
Do you feel from that day forward that you've been kind of solidified in your ontology for being an atheist? I mean, has your work in science and your continuous study led you down that path of saying like, yeah, actually, I think that I'm actually right about there not being this God? I mean, you can't falsify a deistic something, but what's most probable? And so in your view, do you think that the most probable conclusion is atheism, and has your work helped solidify that?
I do think, yeah, my continuing explorations has, led me down to think, here's where these beliefs more likely come from. And it's not because of actual intervention or interaction with the divine, that it seems like it's much more psychological rather than physical interaction with superpowers out in the universe. And I feel like a lot of the philosophical or scientific work out there does such a good job of explaining what we have and give us avenues to answer the questions we currently can't answer, while theistic ones seem to just have to continue to hide further and further in the shadows of what we currently don't know. And even there, where we don't know, it still seems to be the case that atheism or naturalism can still explain it with less baggage. I still think there are really deep philosophical questions that I can't answer well about. Is it possible to go infinitely far in the back? Or does there have to be some ultimate first moment in time? Is there some reason there is something rather than nothing? And I still feel like there's still plenty to explore, and there are still certain conceptual issues that no one has good answers to yet. And so who knows? It could be the case that we keep burrowing down and we do find there is some reason to look at the theism arguments again. But for the most part, I don't see historically that working out. It's never really gone in that direction where we explore something more and more and more and find more and more God. It's always been kind of the opposite direction. We discover more and we figure out, oh, personhood of some sort running things doesn't actually explain the details all that well. I always want to see if there's something to change my mind or at least ameliorate my certainty, but I haven't found something that keeps me up at night and think, maybe God is the better explanation for that point.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Thinking as far as why is there anything rather than nothing, I think anyone who's deep-minded will have that question or at least wonder this at some point in their life. For me, the typical answer of brute fact. While it is not satisfying, it is something I don't think we can know. And I'm not saying we couldn't potentially, but it's like we don't know right now, and I don't see how we would come to know, especially if we can't get beyond a certain point of the start of the universe itself, and especially if the start of this universe itself is just one among many multiverse or some other explanation that makes sense, and we go, whoa, this is infinite. Like, what is this? But while it's not satisfying, even if we try to throw God into the engine like a wrench here, oh, we'll solve why God did it. Then God becomes a brute fact, because then we have to accept, where did God come from? Why does God exist at all to begin with? And then, of course, their answer is, well, duh, silly. He's always existed, and there was no start. Yeah, you're just ending up with the same thing we're ending up with, except, as my friend Stephen from Rationality Rules says, that it's much more expensive. You have to buy God and then buy a brute fact. Whereas we just straightforward buy the brute fact of existence itself without having to posit a God creator, then say brute fact.
Yeah, I definitely go with that, and we are likely to be stuck with some brute facts along the way. Of course, I see a brute fact and I want to brute force my way past it anyways and see, well, I still want to know if there is something behind that. Even if it is the case that there are simply brute facts that we have to accept, we don't necessarily know what the brute facts are. Something might seem absolutely fundamental, but maybe we continue to examine, we keep punching at it, we keep trying to look behind the curtain and find out that brute fact is maybe a little bit more contingent than we first thought, and we can actually understand what might be the machinery behind it. I think the scientific approach is we have to continue to try to explore that question, because we can never really be sure that we've actually hit the ground truth at that point.
Right.
And
would you say there's limitations, though, on the theistic side, where it's like we drill and then we go, hold on, what are we going to find on the other side? If we find out nothing's on the other side, no mind, no being, do you think that there is, and maybe I'm reading and psychoanalyzing a bit here, but it's like, do you think that there's this like non-desire to try and go beyond and kind of, in the ancient world, let's just use an example. Ancients thought that gods or a god caused the volcano to erupt. Mm-hmm. Do we want to drill and find out about tectonic plates and find out the shift in the crust caused the eruption of the volcano? Or was it Baal? Or was it... You see what I'm saying? It's kind of like a lot of Muslims that I find out when I'm looking in Saudi Arabia right here, where they're taking their journey to the Holy Land and walking around and all this. They don't do excavations trying to find out, like, here's some empirical stuff from the 7th century at the start of Islam. They have a narrative, and they don't try to investigate that narrative. They don't want to disrupt that narrative. I've talked to Islamic scholars that are non-Muslims that are like, yeah, they don't do that. Their narrative is enough. Do you think the theistic narrative is enough that hinders people from wanting to get further? Or is that wrong of me to say that theists aren't interested in, maybe I shouldn't say all, right?
Yeah, I don't take you as saying that it's like a necessary thing that if you're a theist, you will not drill down to a certain point, because there are so many examples of theistic scientists and philosophers who do really drill down and, want to understand really fundamental things. And even if they believe in God, they might still say, I want to understand the mind of God. I want to understand why they created things this way rather than another way. Johannes Kepler, when he was applying his mathematical deductions to astronomy and the cosmos, he thought that geometry really explained the mind of God itself. He even said geometry is God itself.
Right.
That's trying to get down to some real brass tacks, ground truth stuff right there. But it's also the case that you're right. I would say probably the average believer in any sort of dogma or ideology doesn't want to drill down enough to actually shake those sorts of things. So, in religion, in politics, any deeply held thought. So I don't want to just label just religious believers with this. This is a human condition. I mean, there are things that probably I would feel uncomfortable if I was deeply questioning myself on it. I have to be honest about that. I may not think of what immediately things would make me uncomfortable because, heck, my brain probably won't even let me think about those uncomfortable things. But I have to realize I'm human, and there are probably some things that I am afraid to dive into. But because I'm also curious and I also think it's important to know what is true, I hope I'm also brave enough to ask myself those sorts of questions.
I don't know. I'm thinking about religions in general and how they always posit an agent of some source of force. But when we go back into the ancient Near East and we see that they're just, either deified humans who once died or they're anthropomorphized natural phenomena, whatever it might be, it makes me really scratch my head and go, why are we still working with that model? Well, I think it's because most humans come from a tradition of religion. And what is religion? I think if we really look at it carefully, it's our reflection of the world and understanding of what we think, how all this is and how we should live our lives and all of that, where you get a bunch of enough people together and they're following it. And I'm wondering if that model is going to become obsolete at some point once we understand that these are just our projections onto the world. Because at some point we realized our perceptions weren't right. We talked about this at lunch earlier. It was it's counterintuitive to think that, there's no God or that there's no higher power. You're born by someone who makes you in their womb, and they take care of you when you're completely helpless for most of your early life. Then all of a sudden you're supposed to be just, I don't need anything. It seems natural to want these things, and science cuts into that whole counterintuitive process.
Yeah, and the fact that it seems to be so intuitive, it seems to be so natural for our minds to think in certain ways that even if it becomes, scientifically deleterious to continue to believe it, it'll still be a natural default. And I'll give you an example from my own research. It was literally the stuff I did in my PhD work. So, when I went to graduate school and going into physics, the area I ended up putting the greatest amount of focus in was actually in physics education research. So, I have to both be a physicist and also a psychologist to some degree. And one of the things that I was really exploring a lot was the intuition that it seems to be extremely natural that people have when they come to our physics classes in high school and college, older adults, whenever they happen to come. They have this view that is very consistent with the way that medieval natural philosophers and Aristotle described motion. That in particular, if you throw something, the reason it continues to go on is there is something coming along and helping push it along, or it somehow self-pushes itself. It requires some sort of force to continue with motion. And this seems to be extremely naturally intuitive. It seems to be extremely stable in students. It seems to exist in all backgrounds, so it seems to be true for Western as well as Eastern students. And it's wrong. It is completely inconsistent with Newtonian physics. And frankly, this sort of intuition is the sort of thing that actually prevented us from realizing that the Earth is going around the sun. Because the idea that if the Earth is going around the sun, well, why don't I feel like I'm being whiplashed at going thousands of miles per hour? We don't have that intuitive sense that, motion is actually this completely relative thing, and you only actually feel acceleration, not velocity. And even after students come to our class, and even if you have a good teacher, still a good fraction of those students will continue to answer physics questions in that older intuitive model. So, and it's not because the students are coming in and they're dogmatic Aristotelians. They did come in and said, no, I've read the metaphysics of Aristotle and I will demand that you follow my convictions. No, it's just that this is the sort of natural way that they approach things. They see how they're supposed to answer the questions on the test, and they can do all the math steps just fine, and they can get an A there, but you still test them conceptually, and you have probably only moved a fraction of the students to proper Newtonian thinking. And this is, again, something with no emotional baggage. Now you start putting values on top of it. So you now have values attached to your intuitive thoughts. So not only am I asking you to think something that doesn't seem right, but now I'm asking you to think something that sounds inherently immoral or evil or destructive. Yeah, even if it is the case that continuing in these intuitive ways are faulty, it's still going to be popping up generation after generation. So I suspect that even if organized religion fades out, there still will be these, supernaturalistic thought tendencies, because it just seems to be how our meat is set up to run in this world.
That's why science is needed, I think, and a good scientific method to help correct our kind of intuitive thought process, so we can understand things that we probably would never have understood without good methodology. And I'm trying to approach religion the same way. I think that it's usually, in some way, shape, or form, even if we're missing the picture, somehow intuitive. And yes, I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, for example, for human to sacrifice another human. You'd look at that and go, are you kidding me? But when you look at the process through an evolution lens, and you realize they didn't know what we know, and they are looking at the natural phenomena in the world, and in some way they're connecting with what you described on the ethical basis of something. So it's more like they're really having these communions with these divine beings and their natural phenomena, the sun and the moon and the stars and everything else. And it's like, I want crops this year. And I know that the most valuable thing to me is my newborn son, my firstborn son, or whatever. I need to sacrifice them because the gods will be pleased by that. And whatever intuitive process that was involved that led them to these conclusions, which makes me realize, now we look back, that was wrong as hell.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's probably also like the best way, like if I could somehow transport myself to 3,000 years ago and seen people doing human sacrifice, if I wanted to persuade them not to do that, my first thought is to ask them, well, why do you think that human sacrifice is going to have this sort of effect? And the reason that they're going to give is not the same sort of way that we justify most of our things, where, for a long time people thought that various religious traditions came about because of spurious correlations. Well, the last time we sacrificed a goat, the storms let up, or things like that. But it seems like very often, from what we can see from especially the Assyrian or Babylonian literature, is that the way that they would connect their actions and divine actions is much more that the connection is at a metaphorical level. And the thing that gave me this insight was this book by Francesca Rochberg called Before Nature. I mentioned before in another video. And it was pointing out that among the things that they were trying to do when exploring the effects of the motions of the stars on us, and you might be thinking well, maybe the way that they were doing astrology is, the last time there was this eclipse, and then there was an earthquake, so maybe there's a connection that way. But it was actually not that sort of thing, because they were also saying, here's the effect of when you see the sun at midnight. And you stop and realize, well, there's no way they ever witnessed that. And you realize, the way that they're actually doing it is, they're actually looking and saying, well, here's the word for sun, which sounds like this other Akkadian word, which is related to the Sumerian word. And so then you find all these other linguistic connections is how they actually try to figure out what are the connections between things. We humans think in terms of metaphors, not in data collection, statistical correlations. And so my hope is, if I got my time machine, went back and tried to explain to them, here's the thing, I can show you empirically, if you sacrifice your children, it's not going to make things better necessarily, because I was also able to hop into my time machine, look at the last 1,000 years and show you, hey, every time you did this, the amount of times it correlated with the storm getting better was no better than 50-50. Okay, maybe I have to explain to them what 50-50 is because they're using a hexadecimal numbering system, but nonetheless, do the math we're saying is hey, this is not going to do anything better for you than just flipping some bones and just hoping they come up the right side. I need to show them, if you take the empirical approach, they themselves can understand we shouldn't be doing these things this way, because we can then see for ourselves and carefully see for ourselves what actually are the causal features of nature, rather than what they think of by myth and dream.
I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson made this funny remark, and he said, Christopher Columbus was an asshole. And he's on Joe Rogan's podcast, he's oh yeah, why? And he's well, I'll tell you why. When he got to the Americas and the Native Americans were there, and he was asking if they would give him some of the crops, give him some of the share of their food. And they were no, we're not doing that. And then he goes, that's fine. He told them an omen. He said something in 7 days, the sun the sun will go blotted out by the moon, whatever. And then all of a sudden it happens, and all the Indians gathered their stuff and they came and they gave it to him. because he predicted a solar eclipse, and it's because they were keeping track of the astrology, if we want to use the term astronomy, but he was keeping track of this stuff and used it to his advantage to manipulate the people because they're prone to this stuff, right? I imagine that might even be easier with the ancients than getting into the statistics, because they'd probably be like, I don't understand. But if you were able to say, listen, next month on this day, this is what's going to happen. And when it does, come find me. Until then, don't kill anyone. I'll tell you the answers you need to know. I feel like that you have to speak their language almost, because they're not there, you know?
And just to actually give actual historical example of that, that's exactly the sort of thing that happened to St. Augustine when he was still a Manichaean before he had left that spiritual movement to then go into hardcore Christianity. As a Manichaean, he believed in like the astrological forces, and in particular, the motions of the suns and planets were due to the fact that these were entities that were thinking and could decide how to move. And when an astronomer in Rome basically tells him, like, yeah, we can actually predict those years ahead in advance. And then when he saw that it was actually literally true, like here happens this solar eclipse right on schedule as predicted, he realized, well, that doesn't fit with the idea that these are entities with free will. If I told you, Derek, that you have free will, but I also predict you're going to go to this particular store at 7 a.m. on this day and you're going to be wearing this color pair of shoes, and exactly that happens, you're going to start questioning that whole free will business, aren't you? So Augustine is having the exact same thought process. This doesn't make sense if the sun and moon are deities and they're actually at war with each other when they're during eclipses. It's like, no, these are completely natural phenomenon that the astronomers completely explain away. So it was one of his reasons for abandoning Manichaeism, and unfortunately the astronomers didn't have a good demonstration against Christianity at that point. So then Augustine might have been a very differently remembered philosopher.
Thank you.